All right, and then we are on Memtes Amud Base 49b, really coming towards the home stretch. So we left off Friday, I'm sorry, with the story that we read with more detail and context in the book of introduction by Art Scroll, the story of the Civil War. Now, the detail that's important now is the fact that when they were putting a dinar into that basket, pulling it over, right? You have Hyrcanus on the inside, Aristobulus on the outside.
Oh, it's the other way.
Other way, yeah. Aristobulus, yeah, it could be. Let's see. Hyrcanus on the outside, Aristobulus on the inside, yep. And Aristobulus and the people are sending money out. And then Hyrcanus and his people were sending animals in to offer in the temple. You familiar?
Yeah.
So Monday, Friday, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
Right, the Civil War was two Hasmonean brothers fighting against each other, and one had surrounded the other inside the Temple Mount. So there's one brother with his people inside the Temple Mount, and the other on the outside. And they would pay for an animal sacrifice and be brought back in. They would do it every day. And then one day, someone on the outside, someone from Aristobulus's people, Hyrcanus's people on the outside, who knew Greek, or he knew Chachmas Yavanis, he knew the wisdom of the Greeks, and he went to the Greeks, or the Romans really, who were invited by Hyrcanus to battle against his brother Aristobulus. He told them, so as long as you're giving them animals for sacrifice, they have God's favor. So you're not going to win. You want to win, you got to stop giving them animal sacrifices. So the next day, when Aristobulus puts in the coin and pulls it over or sends it over the wall for Hyrcanus and his people to receive, they instead of putting a kosher animal, they put a pig. Yeah, the pig went up and
that's right.
put his claws or his feet into the wall, and the whole Israel shook. Okay. So for this, the Gemoro says, because of that, our sages forbade the teaching of Chochmas Yavanis, the wisdom of the Greeks, to children, to their sons, to their children. That's what's relevant for our Gemara here. So it's a prohibition of learning Greek philosophy, really. Or we're not really clear yet exactly what it is, but it's not teaching their children Greek. So it says the Gemara like this. It's if you go to the wide set of lines. Sorry,
they were the ones who gave this advice.
It was a Jew who knew how to communicate with these Romans in this fancy Greek language and tell them, hey, you shouldn't be doing that, or this is working to your detriment. It's because of that, they don't want to teach their children that kind of language. That's what it is. Okay, says the Gemara like this. So if you look at the wide set of lines, count 1, 2, 3, 4 lines down. In the middle of the line, it says Aini. It's Aleph Yud, Nun Yud.
Yeah.
4 lines down in the wider set of lines. Right in the middle of the line, it says Aini. So Gemara says, Aini, is this indeed so? Is it indeed so that it's forbidden to learn the language of Greek? Because that's what the Gemara seems to imply now. The problem is the speaking of Greek, because this guy spoke Greek. He spoke what the Romans spoke and told them that the offerings are working against them. So the Gemara says, is this indeed the case? Well, Amar Rabbi, but Rabbi said, Rabbi made the following observation. Rabbi being Rabbi Uda Hanasi, the compiler of the Mishnah. The Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, Lashon Sursi Lama. Why are people speaking this language of Sursi? I'm guessing Sursi is some sort of Syrian language that was like an import from the Syrian Greeks. So why are you guys talking that language called Sursi? It's a low-class language. Rashi says that it's similar to Aramaic. And it seems to me, says Rashi, that the Sursi is the language that's used in the Jerusalem Talmud. And the nations of the world call it Linga. Linga Surya, I guess, language of Surya. That's how Rashi writes it. Anyway, so Rebbe seems to think that it's a low-class language. It doesn't have the proper, it's not a proper language. So why are the guys speaking Sursi? Ela Eloshin Kurdish, either speak the holy tongue, Eloshin Yavanis, or speak Greek. Those are the only two languages available to you worthwhile talking. This Sursi hybrid thing, I don't like that language. This is what Rebbe said. Likewise, similarly, Omar Rav Yosef, Rav Yosef says, in Bavel, Babylonia, Lashon Arami Lama. Why do you guys speak Aramean? It's a beat up language. It seems to me like the languages that they're knocking are the kinds of languages that are not pure. They're like hybrids, and they prefer like the more precise, pure languages. Anyway, so Rav Yosef says, Bavel in Babylonia, Lashon Arami Lama. Why do you guys speak Aramaic? Ella, rather, or Lashon Kurdish, either speak the holy language, or Lashon Parsi, or speak Persian. So why are you guys speaking in Aramaic? Now, why are we saying these statements? The point we're trying to make here is that Rebbe clearly says either speak Hebrew or speak Greek. So clearly there's no prohibition against speaking Greek because he's encouraging to drop Sursi and choose either Hebrew, Lashon Kodesh, or Greek. But we just learned that the sages forbade Greek, the speaking of Greek, considering the story with the guy who spoke Greek, telling them that the offerings are working to their detriment. And therefore the Gemoro says, Lashon Yavonis L'chud, the language of the Greeks is one issue. The Chachmas Yavonis L'chud, and the wisdom of the Greeks is quite another. So the prohibition that the sages enacted are not in the language of Greek, but in the wisdom of Greek. Which would mean, therefore, that when this person whispered to the Romans who had partnered up with Hyrcanus, telling them that the animal sacrifices they're sending in is working against them, it wasn't enough to just know the language of Greek. You have to know the wisdom of Greeks. So presumably, language, when you use the word language, you can mean two things. You could either mean literally which dialect, like are you speaking English, French, Hebrew, Chinese, or whatever, or when you use the word language, what you could mean is like your mode of expression, the way you express yourself, the way you describe something, right? So two people can feel the same thing and both speak English, but they have a whole different way of expressing themselves, right? Because they speak a different language. They both speak the same dialect. They both speak the same English, and when they speak to each other, they understand each other, but they speak in a different language, a different like the generational gap, so to speak. Different generations speak a different language. Not that they're speaking different dialects. They're all speaking English, but their language, their mode of expression, their way of experiencing these same things is in a very different framework. And that's the wisdom of the Greek rather than, say, the language of Greeks. Right? So, for example, if you want, and therefore, to convince these Greeks that sending over the animal sacrifices is going to work against them, he didn't just have to know Greek technically, but he had to speak in such a way that spoke to the way they understand and perceive the world, which means he has to have known their culture, understand the way they think, understand how they live life, and then he can communicate them in a manner that they'll appreciate what he's saying, not just technically the dialect of the words.
Like
right?
colloquial.
Yes, it's colloquialism, but it's even more than that. It's like the modality of expressing yourself.
Well, it's basically being one of them.
Yeah, it's trying to be one of them, so that way they can understand what you're saying. Like, it's hard.
It's probably eating their food,
Yeah,
dressing
cultural
like
language, not just the technical words you use. Sorry. Yeah.
probably eating their food, dressing like
Thinking the way they do, understand the way they do. How do you perceive the world?
Go
Like
to their places.
For example, Moshe Rabbeinu.
Weltenstein, that's the word I think.
The
Right?
prince in the Egyptian palace.
That's
He
correct.
was able to speak to the pharaoh in the language. So what he had the encyclopedia of references of the pharaoh, the
Right.
dictionary of terms, the gallery of portraits, and the background music to the life of the nation.
That's
He
correct.
was able to get it, and he understood the fears, anxiety, anxiety,
Right.
and depressions, all of the elements that exist within the Egyptian culture. And was able to,
That's correct.
if he would have had a slave,
It's not just a question of this technical Egyptian.
but was he well versed in the cultural context of the?
That's
language?
correct. And then someone appreciates what you're saying. Two people can say the same thing, and one person says that you appreciate it, the other person says that you don't. Because the person who speaks to you in the way you appreciate it shares a certain commonality with you and understands You know that they understand the way you live and the way you think and the way you feel. And then when they communicate, it comes through. Even if it's the same dialect, but it's a manner of speaking. It's a manner of understanding. It's a manner of like.
Maybe it's like the language is the gateway into the culture.
It always is. But here the Gemara is splitting this hair between the language of the Greeks versus the wisdom of the Greeks.
The language
Right.
is like the door.
Yes, but the Gemara is allowing the language of the Greeks. Right? That's what it seems to be saying.
Kind of hard to understand.
Well, we speak English, right? We're not being forced to speak. There's no like a prohibition against speaking English, and we learn Torah in English. But it doesn't equal. That doesn't. Let's put it this way. Sorry.
Might be in a few years. We're not allowed to speak.
Yeah, what I mean is like when you're learning, let's say, when you go through your journey of learning Chassidus, let's say, or learning Gemara, or learning Torah, right? So if you want to, we all have a certain understanding in the way the Gemara operates, the way the Gemara thinks. And when I say certain things, you understand what they are given the context of our shared learning of Gemara. If I were to speak to a very highly intelligent student from McGill and try to explain to him the same Gemara, I have to find a lot more words to explain it. We're speaking in English, and I'd be speaking to that person in English. But the manner in which I would explain it would be very, very different. Because the language, not the dialect, but the language that we use at this table comes in the context of years of learning Gemara together.
A lexicon of some sort.
Yeah, it's hard to put in words what the difference is, but you can sense, when the rabbi speaks and a newcomer comes into the shul, you can sense the rabbi speaking a little different for that person because this person doesn't have the contextual language that we all have shared in common for having learned together for the last how many years, right? So it's not a question of English versus not English. It's a question of cultural dialect and like dialect, cultural language and expressionisms and right. Now I'm suggesting this. Sorry.
Foundational concepts.
Certain axioms we share, certain common cultural appreciations that we share. So I'm saying this because the Gemara distinguishes between the language, Lashon Yavanis, versus Chachmas Lavanis, the wisdom of the Greeks. Had that been the only statement, then I would say, well, one is Greek language and one is Greek philosophy. Right? It's just simple. But the context here is the ban is based on this guy who communicated with the Greeks, telling them, right? So he has to know Greek philosophy to communicate with them. Right? That was the problem. The problem is that this guy communicated to the Greeks, telling them that, hey, when you put the animal sacrifices, it's working to your detriment because now they have God's favor.
Maybe it's not that the problem is not that he communicated it. Maybe it's the problem is that they accepted it.
There we go.
Too close.
There we go. They accepted it from him because he obviously shared Chachmat Yavanis.
Right.
He shared their philosophy. When he spoke,
if he was
they understood he's one of them.
Wouldn't,
there's the point.
they
Exactly.
wouldn't accept it. And
So it's
he
not
should
just
be a
that's
stranger.
right. So it's not just a question of the language in order to communicate with them. It's a question of shared culture to be able to communicate with them.
We're learning Torah from the Greeks.
Sorry?
Almost like we're learning Torah from the Greeks by accepting their advice on what to do with in the case of putting the pagan side.
It was the other way around. It was a Jew who told them.
Oh, it was a Jew.
It was a
right?
Jew who knew how to speak their language, and now we're learning not just Lashon Yavanis, but Chachmas Yavanis. He knew how to speak their language in a manner that they appreciated what he's saying, because obviously he shared their philosophical understandings and their way of viewing the world, and they appreciate what the Jew was saying, considering he was so steeped in their thinking, not just in their language, not just in the words. And that's the ban here. The ban is on that wisdom, not on that language. Yeah, what you can say? Sorry.
I'm just saying. Usually, if a Jew would tell you anything, they would just shut him. What do you know? You're a Jew.
Exactly. You're a primitive Jew. What do you know? But he's speaking their language, and now you appreciate it. Yeah.
Every time I ran a marathon, I used to think of the Greeks.
Yeah.
They started it.
Yep. Okay, so the Gemara presses further. And the Gemara says, "V'chachmas Yavanis mi asida." Is Greek philosophy, Greek wisdom itself even forbidden? Who said that's forbidden? V'amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda said the name of Shmuel. Mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, who said the name of Rabbi Shimon son of Gamliel. He said the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. I'll take this little note here on the side. I want to see what it says. Yeah. And where's the pasuk? There it is. The pasuk says, so Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel again is on the Davidic line of Nisim, of the leaders of the Jewish people. Like the Yehuda HaNasi is part of the same line. It goes back to Hillel the Elder. and back to King David, and kept on going all the way down to the Babylonian exilarchs. So he's in
That's
this.
why he didn't put the Hanukkah story in.
That was Abu Danasi, that's correct. So in that context, that's right. It's important. I'm giving this context, it's important for what's about to be said. So Bashim ben Gamliel said, "My diksiv, what's the meaning of the pasuk which reads in Eicha? Eini oilala nafshi. My eyes were like oilala, like woe unto my own soul. We call benois idi from all the daughters of my city." This is the Eicha, the Lamentation book that describes. It's one big heartfelt tear on the destruction of the temple. The Eicha, we read it on the 9th, we read it on Tisha B'Av, right? We fast. So what's the meaning of this pasuk? That the person is crying about all the daughters of his city. So it says it B'Shim Gamliel. Here's what it means to me. Elef yolodim hayeh bebeis Abba. There were 1,000 children educated in my parents' home, my father's home, my father being Gamliel, right? B'Shim ben Gamliel, B'Shim ben Gamliel. So there's 1,000 children in the home of my father. 500 of us learned Torah, and 500 of us learned Greek, the philosophy of the Greeks. So you had this massive academy, and it was split. Those who excelled in Torah study and those who excelled in Greek philosophy. Now, it's hard to imagine that those who learned Greek philosophy in the house of Rabbi Gamliel didn't learn any Torah, but presumably it meant this was their expertise. Okay? And Rabbi Gamliel says, and amongst all these 1,000 students, there's none left after the destruction. Ela ani, but for me, Khan, I'm here. Uben achi abba ba'asya, and the son of my father's brother, my cousin, basically, in Asya, in Asia Minor. I'm guessing somewhere in Turkey. So of 1,000 of us, there's 2 of us left. This is what the Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says. Now, what's the point? Why is the Gemara raising this story here? Because here we see Rabbi Gamliel is teaching in his academy, he's teaching 500 kids Greek philosophy. So why would the Gemara come and tell us that Greek philosophy is a problem when seemingly we have here a whole academy of people learning Greek philosophy? Says the Gemara, shiny shall base Rabbi Gamliel. Those who study at the house of Rabbi Gamliel are different. They have a unique law. Why? To krivim l'malchus hava. They were close to the kings. Because it was their job to be like the lobbyists on behalf of the Jewish people to the Greek or the Roman overlords, therefore they had to study Greek philosophy in an effort to be able to communicate with their Roman overlords for diplomatic reasons. Yeah. So the Tanya, as we learned, misaper koimi, someone who takes a haircut in the koimi fashion, a haircut in the komi fashion, doesn't explain what that is, whereas Rashi doesn't tell us what it is either. Sari shalafanov, maniach bluris macharev. Yeah, so Rashi says that he. I remember this actually. It's machlokes Rashi and Rambam what blurius is. What this is? Either you're leaving a lot of hair in the front and shaving everything else around, or it's the reverse. You're shaving everything in the front and leaving like a tail in the back. Like it's
complete story portion.
Yeah, like you have till today in some of the Far East countries, you have it where people they shave all the front of their head. These monks, they shave the front of their head, and the back they leave up these big thick ponytails. So it's either that or it's the other way around, where they shave the whole back and they leave the front up. Anyway, so yeah, it's a thing. So for me, it wouldn't work. So we're taught in the Mishnah text, which reads, Misaper komi, someone who does this komi haircut. Hareze b'darki amoiri. This is a prohibition of following the ways of the Amorites. There's a prohibition against darki amoiri. It's a prohibition against behaving in such a fashion that mimics those who are the Amorites. Essentially, it is anyone who does idol worship. So if monks dress a certain way, it'd be prohibited for us to wear those kinds of clothing. Right? And likewise with all kinds of things of that nature. So this haircut, says the Gemara, falls in that prohibition. Because this is a unique haircut for these people. Okay? Now the Mishnah text continues. Abtubulus ben Reuven, Abtubulus son of Reuven. Interesting to note, the son has a Greek name and the father has a Jewish name. Abtubulus son of Reuven. Hitiru, they permitted him, the saper komi, to wear this komi haircut. Why? Shukarov lemalchus, because he was close to the monarch, to the ruling sovereign class, and he was like a kind of diplomat. So they let him dress the way they dressed, so that way he can communicate on our behalf. And the same text continues. The house of Rabbi Gamliel was allowed to teach their children and their school Greek philosophy because they were close to the sovereignty. In order to communicate with them, they had to be able to understand them and learn Greek philosophy. So this is the end of the discussion. What's the conclusion on the practical level? That it's prohibited to learn Greek philosophy, which by extension would mean maybe any decidedly secular studies, with the exception of those who need it for the sake of diplomatic relations.
Or about
Oh, so that's what I'm going to get to.
Rambam,
So that's what I was going to get to. So I want to share with you the Tanya perspective on this, which is not it's not directly lifted from this Gemara. It comes from this Gemara along with others, but it stacks very well on top of what we're learning here. So in Tanya in chapters 6, 7, and 8, he describes the natural world, and in terms of the spiritual state of the natural world, including our place in it as natural biological beings, meaning not our godly souls position in this world. That's other parts of Tanya deal with that. This is our human part. Us as a human being is part of the biological nature of the world, our animal soul. And he describes there that the majority of the world is what's called klipas noga. Klipat noga. Klipa means a shell, which means it conceals godliness. And that's the natural state of our world. It conceals godliness. You look at the table, you just see a table, you don't see God. It conceals, it's like a shell that conceals the truth that there's God giving life to it. Right now, God's giving life to this table, but we're not aware of it, we don't see it because there's a klipa, there's a shell. But then there's added this word, klipat noga. Noga means like a ray of light. It's a term borrowed from Yecheskel's vision, Ezekiel's vision of a chariot, where there it says, it describes the chariot, it describes negative experiences, and then it says, the negative experiences are ishtim slakachas, ruach sara, there's the descriptions of negative vision, and then it says, the noga loy saviv, it has a ray surrounding it. So there's a layer of the negativity that has a ray. That's the noga. What's klipat noga? What does it mean? That it's a klipa that conceals God, but it has a ray. What that means is that in its default setting, it conceals God. But it's got a ray of hope because it could be used for a holy purpose. So this table, its natural state of being is to conceal God's presence. But it has the option that us can sit around the table, learn Torah, and now this table is supporting Torah learning. So it expresses godliness in this world, currently. And the same thing is true with the majority of things in this world. A cup of water, we can drink it for the sake of serving Hashem, or drink it for the sake of selfish thirst. In the case of selfish thirst, it does not express godliness. In the case of, hey, I need to drink so I can serve Hashem, now it expresses godliness. And the same thing with most of this world. Then he goes on to explain that depending on the type of item you're interacting with, the risk of misusing it becomes higher. So say, for example, a good glass of wine. So the risk of me overindulging in that is higher than the risk of me drinking a glass of water. It's much easier for me to drink a glass of water and say, I'm thirsty and I need to drink a water so I can keep on learning, rather than, hey, let me stop drinking a glass of wine. And in my head, remember, hey, I'm drinking this wine because it's going to put me in a better mood so I can learn Torah later. There's a higher risk of me just enjoying the wine because, hey, the wine is dead delicious, right? So as you increase in the complexity of what this world has to offer, the bigger the risk is that it'll affect me negatively in that I'm taking it in a selfish manner. In that regard, he says, the highest of all risks, this is the end of chapter 8, the highest of all risks is the study of secular philosophy and teachings. It could be used in a positive manner. In the same way, going to work every day could be used for godliness. I'm going to work because I need to make a living so I can support my family and live a good Jewish life the way Hashem wants. Now my business is serving Hashem. The same thing is true of learning engineering to become an engineer so I can serve Hashem. Right? So in secular studies, it's also that option that it could be used for the sake of serving Hashem. Not just for the sake of making a living like a parnasa, you're saying. On a higher level, says there Alter Rebbe, there's the study of secular studies in the context of Rambam and Ramban. Those who know how to use secular philosophy itself, not just as I'm learning it so I can make a living, so later I can serve Hashem with the living I've made. But the actual study itself becomes incorporated in Torah. You see this in Rambam. Rambam's writing, he seamlessly weaves between Aristotle and scripture. So in Rambam's study itself of secular studies, it's not secular studies for the sake of making a living. He didn't study secular studies at all to make a living initially. Only later, when his brother died, he started charging for his medical practice because he needed to make a living and support his brother's family and others. But initially, he was studying these things because that's the way he understood a deeper level of Torah. His deepest level of learning Torah was by understanding the natural sciences and so on. That's an even higher level of elevating the secular studies to be incorporated into godliness. But the risk is even higher. Because if I don't know how to use secular studies for the sake of learning Torah, what do I have? What am I left with? Secular ideas that imprinted the way I think in my mind. So what's the risk of drinking a glass of wine for my own personal pleasure? My body took a little pleasure, a little selfishness. But if I intake secular studies, not for the sake of godliness, and not using the lens of Torah to learn those secular studies, it's just for the sake of the beauty of what Greek philosophy has to offer. The risk of the negative impact on my mind is much deeper. Because now it affects the way I think, not just what I ate. So the risk is higher. That's what he describes in the end of chapter 8. And if we want to be much more careful to be sure that what they are, when they study and what they're studying in terms of secular philosophy and Greek philosophy, as putting it here, we want us to be careful that they know how to incorporate that into their Torah learning. And that's perhaps the struggle the Gemara is going through here. We're not going to ban outright the use of these languages because we're all speaking English. Why is English different than Greek? Okay, so we're not banning Greek. On the contrary, Greek's a good language, as we learned earlier. Either Lashon Kodesh or Greek. It's a great language. It's very expressive. And you could use it beautifully in the learning of Torah. But we got to be careful with the wisdom of Greeks. But then there are some people that need it. So we'll let them do it because they need it. Right? They need the wisdom of Greeks so that they can be diplomats and be able to serve the people using Greek philosophy. Right? So there's like a kind of struggle here in ensuring that when we do allow the engaging in Greek philosophy, it's done in the context of serving Hashem and serving the people. Like in this case, if you learning Greek philosophy, so they can lobby on behalf of the people. And furthermore, to the point, Rabbi Gamliel made sure that it was the same study house where you had the 500 learning Torah and the 500 learning Greek philosophy. And not, God forbid, people learning Greek philosophy because they need to be diplomats completely detached from Torah. It's got to be in that same, it's got to be integrated. Because otherwise, it just has a negative impact on the person learning. And that's perhaps like the undercurrent of the struggle that the Gemara is trying to go through to allow for the study of Greek philosophy, but not too much, and to make sure it's being used in such a fashion that's actually useful, rather than just pursuing it for its own sake. Perhaps. Okay, so here's the plan, God willing, for this week. Tomorrow we're going to conclude the Gemara, which is the Gemara's commentary on the Mishnah, which spoke about the different people that as they passed away, qualities that they embodied died with them. Right? When Rabbi Yehuda passed away, fear of sin died with him, and so on and so forth. So we're going to conclude that Gemara with that. And then till the end of the week, hopefully we'll finish it, but till the end of the week, we're going to learn an in-depth talk from the Rebbe on the last lines of Sotah, on the very last lines, on the subject of humility and fear of sin. The Rebbe is going to analyze the Mishnah and the Gemara, so we'll learn that. And then, God willing, a week from today, Monday, we'll begin the last chapter of Psachim. So we're going to officially start on Monday the new chapter of Psachim, and we'll finish as much as we can of that Sikha before Shabbos. Hopefully we'll finish all, and on Monday we'll start with the new Gemara. Okay, have a wonderful day, Eden.
Very much.